I am delighted to be joined by not one, but two lovers of Owen Barfield to talk about their book, What Barfield Thought, an introduction to the thought of Owen Barfield. And that is Landon Loftin and Max Leyf. Hello there.
Well,
So,
thank you, Mark. And
hey,
we're
yeah,
also
look, it's really great to share the enthusiasm for Barfield, this figure who's been so influential on us all in our particular ways. I wondered whether to try and launch straight into his ideas, I could ask you both, what was it about Barfield that first grabbed you? Because I know that it was a thought of his that particularly grabbed me, and that was on the back of doing my PhD about Plato, when in one of his books, Barfield makes this remark: people could read the whole of Plato and even write books about him and still not have understood the first word that he said. And I was sort of scandalized almost by that thought and wanted to know what he meant. But it also rang true to me because I'd done this PhD on Plato and wasn't sure that I'd fully understood what Plato was going on about, in fact. Now, there's a whole story that Barfield has about that, what distances us from Plato and what can join us back up again. But we'll come to that, no doubt. But look, what was it that first grabbed you? What shocking Barfield thought, if there was such a thing, first grabbed you about him and made you want to know more about this chap and his ideas?
Yeah, I'll start if that's okay. Very similar to you, Dr. Vernon. I had this idea that ancient philosophy and literature was always being read in sort of this flat, unhistorical way. Of course, that's not an original observation by any means, but I still felt unsatisfied with the explanations for that. And Barfield seemed to me to be pointing us in the right direction, that his understanding of consciousness and how it's evolved over time, and his particular account that's rooted in his understanding of the development of language and poetry, it seemed deeply compelling to me. Furthermore, my other reason is that I picked up a C.S. Lewis book when I was about 16 and was just sort of intoxicated by it, as many people are, especially young readers. And still to this day, I love reading C.S. Lewis, but I felt a little suspicious of myself. I was a little bit too taken with Lewis. And so when I heard about the great war between him and Owen Barfield, this person who Lewis called his wisest and best teacher, yet who disagreed with him fundamentally on some important things, I knew that was somebody I needed to pay attention to, and the effort's been well rewarded.
Look, we're going to come back to that. That opens up a nice theme about the differences and similarities with Lewis as well. So that's two big thoughts we've got. But Max, what about yourself?
I of course appreciate and resonate with what both of you said. Largely, shared the same experience. It is. I liked the way Landon put it. There's something about C.S. Lewis that he's such a powerful, argumentative force that sometimes you feel a little bit almost compelled to agree with him. I'm currently just reading Mere Christianity, and it's kind of a funny experience. You feel as though, like, if I weren't a Christian, I would feel like a complete idiot for not being one. And so C.S. Lewis is sometimes. He's just so compelling with his argumentation. Owen Barfield has, I think, quite a different quality. He's a little bit more subtle and actually kind of inviting the reader to take the steps, him or herself. And I share your feeling about feeling a sort of like I don't know, vacuity almost in the way that many ancient philosophers are taught. It's like they can't. They're obviously there's a sort of haunting impression that I had. It's like they're clearly talking about something of great significance. Otherwise, they wouldn't bother to write these things. And nevertheless, in the way that it's first presented, that's it seems to be missing. It's like almost like a joke without a punchline. Maybe it's like you can learn all the facts, but if you don't see how they, that lightning strike that kind of illuminates how they hang together, you just shoveling facts. And for me, though, I actually had quite a somewhat idiosyncratic introduction to Barfield. It wasn't through C.S. Lewis, as for most people. It was rather through Rudolf Steiner. I first made the point of contact with Steiner, and then Owen Barfield was clearly, influenced to a substantial degree by Rudolf Steiner. He describes the way in which, when he first encountered Steiner, it was like, almost a shocking corroboration of what he took to be some of his most, controversial and even eccentric theories. There he found corroborated Rudolf Steiner, and then some. And so for me, encountering Barfield from Steiner, Barfield is often, maybe not often, but I've heard people compare Barfield to a sort of gateway drug to anthroposophy and Rudolf Steiner's teachings. And it's a funny comparison, especially again, since I feel I have gone the reverse direction. But encountering Barfield was so exciting and so refreshing in a way. Steiner can be somewhat, let's just say Steiner doesn't make it easy. In fact, there's a film called The Challenge of Rudolf Steiner, in which people would just interpret, like people are interviewed and basically they just try to interpret that phrase, what is the challenge of Rudolf Steiner? And there's 1,000 different ways that can be construed, but suffice it to say that Steiner does not make it easy. He actually he really demands a lot from the reader or from the listener. Owen Barfield, to some extent, it's similar. I think something that makes me skeptical is when people presume to have understood Barfield on the initial encounter, and maybe that's possible for some people, but my impression is it actually demands sustained effort and meditation, and not only just to learn his theory, but to also understand why it's true, how it can be true, and that just takes time. And so for me, encountering Barfield was such a delight because he is because of his facility with words. He is such a poet, inherently, and he just has this, real felicity of expression, and I appreciated the way he brings that to bear on some of these very, very difficult and esoteric in the sense of not commonly known or not commonly accepted theories about the world we live in and our own origins and our own histories. So
yeah, look, I'm really glad you brought in anthroposophy as well, because that is an area that I have never settled in my own mind, actually, about Barfield and anthroposophy. I feel very persuaded by Barfield, but very rapidly get lost with Steiner. And in fact, in my own book, A Secret History of Christianity, in the first edition, at least, I didn't mention Steiner at all, which was a mistake. I can see that now. I have slipped in a reference in a second edition, but it's still an area that I sort of wonder about a lot. So that would be also really good to pick up on. I wonder whether having set a bit of an agenda then with these three areas, I wonder whether we could sort of wind back and consider his relevance to reading ancient philosophy, because that in a way maybe helps set some of the groundwork for his ideas. And perhaps I could frame it like this. I was recently listening to a discussion of the origins of democracy in ancient Athens. And I was really delighted because one of the historians involved in the discussion, Tom Holland, who's a very great ancient historian, did recognize that ancient Athens' notion of democracy was very, very different from the modern sense of democracy. The differences is rather concealed by the use of the same word. And in particular, Tom Holland picked up on the recent work of a really fascinating historian again called Greg Anderson, who has written a book called The Realness of Things Past. And one of the things which he really stresses in that book of his is that in the ancient world, relationships with the gods, with the wider spiritual ecology, as much as what we would call the natural ecology, was absolutely fundamental and crucial. And a vast percentage of the activities of ancient Athenians were organized around relating to the gods and goddesses of place, particularly. And that meant that their sense of what it was to participate in their city life was very different from ours. And so when it comes to democracy, it wasn't based on things like rights or equality, any of those modern notions which are so important to democracy, but was rather a way of organizing the civic side of life in a way that could be harmonious with the wider life within which everybody participated, particularly through festivals, libations, the sense and pulse of the year and so on. And that included everybody in the city-state. The men did the rather dreary bit, you might say, of sort of civic organization, which is why men only voted, or free men only voted. But that wasn't some sort of scandal at the time. It was just sorting out the civic side so that in a way the main interest of ancient life could be sustained, which involved women and slaves as well. And so I was really happy about that. But it felt like it still didn't go as far as Barfield would go, which is to say that a completely different consciousness of existence was obtaining then. And unless you do more than just kind of smuggle in ancient beliefs that we don't have now, and perhaps in brackets, because, you know, say a bit more like because we've progressed in our understanding of the natural world, which Barfield would certainly be against, you still don't really understand the radicality of the ancient world. Now, you guys do go into this in your book, but I wonder whether you could just sort of pick up on that a bit and talk about really kind of how strange, but also how thrilling it is to read about the ancient world in the full way that Barfield invites us to imagine.
Definitely. Maybe I can take this, Landon, and then
Go
head
for
up
it.
to you. I think it's just what you said, Mark. Like Barfield actually gives us the tools in order that allow for our readings of those ancient philosophers to really, in my experience, just really come to life. You're not just like learning propositions about what somebody said or what somebody thought, but you're actually, again, my experience is like you're able to experience why it was true, why what they're saying was true. And so again, for me, reading Barfield, that's one, it's like it opens the shutters onto, so you can look back into history, and the light from history can just flood through the open window. And I like to, like, one thing that reading Barfield also, and not just reading it once, but repeated reading and just kind of assimilation, or allowing my adequation to his theory, it allowed me to see this, because when we hear gods regulating ancient life, there's something, it can be, it's hard for us, it's far away from our everyday experience. Reading Barfield helped me like understand again why it's like it has to be that way. And this is not like Barfield doesn't sketch it out in quite this way, but I try to do it in the book. And the way of, because I take the measure of a good theory is when you're when before like what seemed like perfectly random and contingent facts or perceptions, in the light of the proper theory, they will appear almost there, or it's like be that way. And reading Barfield helped me understand like this notion of like where the gods came from, and the way I would try to lay it out is, if we this is harkening back to Goethe as the person who really went a long way, and then Goethe, as interpreted by Rudolf Steiner, went a long way in inoculating our historical, our way of perception with this the theory of metamorphosis. And the idea is like you encounter discrete snapshots in time, but then you have to invoke your imaginative power to establish continuity between those snapshots. Goethe says something like, in nature there are no leaps, something like that. And but you don't see that through your senses. You have to supplement what your senses provide with your imagination. And what I've, this exercise that I've gone through is to try to say, how do you establish a continuity between like animals around us and animal consciousness and human consciousness. And if you imagine, so we have clearly like distinct, those are two, distinct and discrete perceptions. The animal consciousness on the one hand, which is informed by this kind of innate natural wisdom that we give the name of instinct. And it's really, it's like a perfect wisdom in the sense that the animal always knows what to do. It doesn't have to deliberate, in a kind of agonizing over different options. animal is sort of, again, informed by this wisdom of nature. We, of course, still retain some like vestiges of that in all of our physiology. Obviously, like I never had to learn how to beat my own heart, for instance, or grow my fingernails. It's something I inherit. But there's also clearly a part of us that has, in a certain way, you could think of being cast into exile, or certainly like departed or detached from that inheritance of natural wisdom. And if I then try to say, like, set those up as two discrete perceptions, what I'm familiar with in just like kind of ordinary waking rational consciousness, and then what I can live into through like observation of the way animals respond and react in their environments. I try to fill in the intermediary stages, and if I do that, the idea that gods would be active in a almost like in a compulsory way in the psyche, it seems like almost that it has to be that way. If you imagine the intermediary stage between this sort of almost kind of like existential freedom that we have as humans, because we're able to basically in abstraction just set our own aims, our own goals, our own the ends towards which we strive, whereas the animals in which those ends are inherited from nature. An intermediary phase is like, the way it would look is you have like the promptings of powerful beings that to some extent you can neglect or refuse to heed, but not just in a like easy way. You have it's clear that the sense of like commandments that would come from something higher than you, and you feel this compulsion almost to align yourself with those things, and you also feel that by departing, like moving away from those things or refusing to take them in, you're in a certain way like going contrary to a natural order, a natural economy of creation. And so for me, this isn't like something that reading Barfield has. Again, I'll go back to where I started that and then turn this over to Landon, but it's made what seemed just like, more or less arbitrary differences between animals and animal consciousness and human consciousness. It's made that seem almost self-evident, like it has to be that way. How else did we arrive here? So I hope I said something of interest, but I'll turn it over to Landon now. Maybe he wants to add to that or take it in a different direction.
Yeah, I love this idea in Barfield that Max is referring to, this slow emergence of human consciousness as we know it from nature. And he also talks about it in terms of the transition from evolution to history. And I think it's very useful when we look back, as far as we can into the record of philosophy and literature in the world. And we see that there's a participation in the natural world. There's sort of we get the sense that people wrote in an intermediary stage between where we are and where, and I don't mean this in any derogatory way, and where non-human creatures that we share the planet with are, in that they were still a consciousness of nature acting in and through them. And so when we think of the gods, and then we think about the gods as they're associated with various aspects of nature, we think of a discrete person who magically controls the waves, and they call them Poseidon and that kind of thing. But of course, that is an example of what Barfield called logomorphism. It is so difficult for us to conceive, not just that people had different thoughts, but thought differently about the world in a way that was much more conscious of and in tune with the world outside of our skin.
Can I add one to what you said,
Yes.
Landon?
Yeah.
It's just exactly right. It's not only that they had different thoughts, but they thought differently about the world. They also had a different relationship to thought per se. I think that's really key. We have a certain experience of how thoughts arise and our relationship to thoughts. The other stages of consciousness, other states of consciousness have a fundamentally different relationship to thoughts. We can get an entry point into this if we just consider the relationship to thoughts that we sustain during dreams, for instance.
Yeah, and I think that's the difference between consciousness and self-consciousness. One way of thinking about Barfield's understanding of how consciousness has evolved is that self-consciousness has become predominant, and it has to do with our relation to our own way of thinking, not only the way of thinking itself. But I like this term that Barfield uses, logomorphism. It's a handy term to think about our tendency to misread the literature and philosophy that comes to us from the ancient world. And it's because it's not just that we're misunderstanding their thoughts, we're misunderstanding their way of thinking. And one example that Barfield often points to is this idea of, wind or breath and spirit. And there's this, the farther you look back in every language I know of that we can trace its roots confidently very far back, we find this closer and closer relationship between these concepts till we get these words that just, they don't mean, wind literally and spirit or soul metaphorically. There's just a word and it means all that we have, divided. We have all these divided concepts and they can all just, fit semantically in one word, but it's so difficult to imagine. And I remember after the first time I read Poetic Diction, that was my first Barfield book, I went on a walk out at a walking trail near here. And I walked, and my goal was I wanted to imagine what it was like to not draw a distinction between wind and spirit. What is that like? What is the world like? What does it feel like and look like if I can put myself in that mindset? And I'll tell you now, I don't think I succeeded, but I at least made some steps in that direction of starting to see the world in a completely different way. And
I very much, I think that this word pneuma in the Greek or ruach in the Hebrew, and then the other languages you intimate that if you translate ancient Greek now, you have to decide whether to say spirit or wind or breath. And, back then, as it were, it was seen as part and parcel of one and the same thing. Plato does talk about this. He talks about how when pneuma is taken in, i.e. when wind becomes breath, it then becomes spirit. And for Plato, he's able to say it's like a cycle of pneuma, from the outside in, that we now think of as air and breath and kind of our vitality. But as we're saying, we're invited through Barfield to actually try and imagine, not just articulating it differently as I've just done, but actually the experience itself of living in that world where everything that you were conscious of was always already part of some much wider process that you related to by devotion, by libation, by relationship. Well, I don't know if we've quite said, but by participation, of course, is another key Barfieldian word. And the whole of life was organized around that. And another really wonderful image that he uses is he says that nowadays we're rather like cameras, that we imagine ourselves to be going around taking kind of snapshots of the world. And the camera, what's on inside the black box of the camera, is sort of disconnected from the world, mediated by the lens of thought, you might say. But we kind of grab things and have representations in our minds, therefore, of the world, which we then capture in our thoughts. But Barfield says in the ancient world, it was much more like an aeolian harp being human, which is to say that the wind blows across the strings of the aeolian harp and the sounding board makes the music. And your agency back then is much more about how to tune in best with the wind and to cultivate the virtues of the soundboards that might make the most beautiful music. So it's a much more porous outside-in notion of what it is to be human. And I think you see that certainly in Homer, in more mythological writing, overtly mythological writing. That's a way of trying to explore that participative notion of being in the world. But even in Plato, the way that Plato mixes, sure, rational thought, but in with myth and in with theories that don't mean a kind of abstract notion that you then put to the test, but actually pictures that help you contemplate what's going on. Theoria originally means contemplation in the world around you and your participation in it. So it's think part of the reason why it's so challenging is that it really asks for a kind of breakdown of our sense of self, in order to, well, not return, but in order to remake. Because another thing that's really important to think about Barfield is he's not nostalgic about the past. He wants this sense of forward movement. Max, you want to say some more?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on comments that both of you have made. I really appreciated, Mark, your reference to Barfield's metaphor to describe the different, I guess, like functions or instruments that we through which we relate to I guess, like, inspiration and consciousness. The idea of the Aeolian harp, it's like nature or the spirit is sounding through us, basically, and we're like a vessel. And you see this, like you alluded to in the ancient epics. They begin the epic by invoking the muse, inviting the muse to basically sound through them, and they become, like an alien harp. And if we contrast that to our experience, obviously it's very different. I think Coleridge captures it very neatly in his phrase. It might be from Frost at Midnight. I can't remember the exact poem, but where he says, "We receive but what we give. In our hearts alone doth nature live," something like that. In other words, it's a different. If we want to achieve the participation that was basically kind of just naturally present, spontaneously present for ancient people, it actually takes substantial initiative on our part. And it's difficult because, like you mentioned, it requires a reimagination of the self, and together with all the terms, like it's not really possible to coherently conceive of a self except in this entire, like a whole ecosystem or ecology of different concepts. And of course, the most obvious polarity is self and world. And to really grasp, like, Barfield's theory of the evolution of consciousness and the evolution of language as well, which are fundamentally not separate things at all. You have to be able to those concepts, the sharp differentiations that we've drawn today, have to become much more malleable and much more fluid for us. And as long as we don't do that, it's always going to be a hang up for us, like trying to understand or trying to even come close to apprehending what ancient writers intended when they use certain word. One of the worst obstacle for it is to imagine, like, oh, I'm familiar with that word and the way it's used today, therefore I understand what he's saying. And that's the first thing that has to be overcome, is set aside that kind of conceit of knowledge about it. And I'll just, like, give an example of like how the same hang up, something like the way this hang up is immediately present to us even today. And that's in, how difficult it is between saying, using the word man to refer to humanity compared to referring to, like, the male aspect of humanity. And this is obviously, like, a source of endless contention, I guess. And for me, always, like, in the same way that Plato's allegory of the cave is an iconic, image of what it means to throw off the shackles of conceits of knowledge and attempt the philosophical ascent. The story of the creation of Eve out of Adam's side, to me, it supplies, like, an analogous image to understand how meaning, out of a single origin, common origin, ramifies and bifurcates, trifurcates. You gave the example of breath, ruach, pneuma, spiritus. Consider the way in which Adam, before Eve emerged. You have to understand that it didn't mean the same thing as Adam subsequently meant after Eve had emerged. Why? Because Adam, before Eve, also contained everything that would later be called Eve. Man, before woman, also contained everything that would later be called woman. In the same way, pneuma, before it diverges into these separate meanings, it's not reducible to any single one of them. You can't say, well, this is the correct meaning or that is the correct meaning. Or even you can't just, like, amalgamate them together and say altogether it's the correct meaning. No. It's a state of, like, superposition or something. It's a state of potency. pluripotency that is later capable of differentiating into all the subsequent meanings that we're familiar with. Pneuma means neither breath nor spirit or mind nor ghost, but all of those things, and yet no single one of those things. It's like Landon said, the exercise you can try to undertake to really see the anterior unity of all these meanings.
Yeah, the reference there to superposition is quite a potent one nowadays, I guess, referring there to the way that quantum states can exist at multiple levels simultaneously. But Landon, do you want to add a bit more?
I just wanted to follow up on Max's point that thinking of all that exists in a state of potency and it's sort of unfolding and going through this process of inner development, which in many ways has brought us into an unfortunate position over the course of history, is that we're idolaters in Barfield's sense of the term. We see the outsides of nature, but we don't see through the natural world to, spirit or the spiritual significance that it manifests. And but to the point that you made earlier, Mark, that for Barfield, it was important that we're not trying to go back to where all these things that we know, these discrete concepts and ideas that organize our perception of the world, we're not trying to go back to where those existed in a state of potency. It's good on the whole that things have, unfolded and differentiated in the way that they have, if only because that allows us or gives us the potential to not go back to Barfield's original participation, but to final participation, where we self-consciously participate in the life of nature. And I also wanted to, maybe the moment's passed, but we were talking about this idea of self-consciousness arising and humans sort of arising out of nature in a way, and that being one way of thinking about the evolution of consciousness. And stated abstractly, that's a hard idea, but Barfield applies it in many ways. One that I find really interesting, and if you'll permit me just to read from one moment from the book, is when Barfield considers questions like, why, when we look back in the history of literature, do we see an increase in poetry? And then if you fast forward, it's an increase in prose. And people are like, oh, people they couldn't write, so it's oral tradition and helped them to remember if they put things into verse. And it's like, sure, that's fine. But Barfield wasn't content just to say, yeah, that explains it and move on. He wanted to really understand the significance. And so here's some, I think, just beautiful quotes that illustrate what we're talking about more broadly. This is our commentary. It says, before the rise of self-consciousness, Barfield argued, human beings participated in the life of nature in a way that modern people are unable, except in rare moments, to do. Objectively, Barfield said, quote, we could only describe the earlier stages of this process as a time when man, not only as a body, but also as a soul, was a part of nature in a way in which we today find it difficult to conceive. Subjectively, he could not yet call his soul his own. The farther back we penetrate, the more indistinguishable would his acts and utterances become from processes taking place in nature. And then he goes on in just a little bit to finish by saying, so just as the myths still live on in the ghostly life as fables after they've died as real meaning, so the old rhythmic consciousness of nature, it should rather be called participation than consciousness, lives on as the tradition of metrical form. We can only understand the origins of meter by going back to the ages when men were conscious not merely in their heads, but in the beating of their hearts and the pulsing of their blood, when thinking was not merely of nature, but was nature herself.
Yeah, that's a great vision there. Thinking was not just of nature, but was nature herself. The idea that the world around us, as William Blake might put it, is imagination. It's not that we do imagining to try and leap out of our heads to connect with the wider world, maybe a bit like Coleridge was suggesting. We only receive in terms of what we give, but that actually the whole unfolding is part of what we now experience only as our isolated imagination. Max, you have your hand raised again.
Yeah, I just wanted to elaborate on a point that Landon brought up and kind of connect it back to what we were saying moments ago. It's somewhat problematic to think of, or it's problematic in the sense of it's not going to give you a complete picture. It's abstract to think of man just merely descending through evolution. It's like, how does man arise out of nature, of animals? That's true, but it's like it's a problem analogous to the blind man and the elephant. It's like, that's true, but it's a one single aspect of something that is much more comprehensive. It's also, in order to sort of complement that of man emerging out of nature, you also have to see nature emerging out of man, and then you realize you're encountering one of these stumbling blocks that we have already alluded to in respect to like spirit, with the way it differentiates, the way man and woman, woman differentiates from man. You have to be able to see, like, it's not just man emerging out of nature. It's actually something that for which we maybe don't have a word, but some prior state differentiating into nature and into man. So the nature that we think of now, if we imagine we could just back project that into nature before man emerged out of it, that's a like textbook example of what Landon has in Barfield have called logomorphism. It's a sort of, anachronism. The nature that, when we say nature today, what we intend by the word nature, what we understand by the word nature, simply did not exist before man differentiated out of it. What we see now is a polarization of man on the one side and nature on the other side. It's perfectly logomorphic to imagine that before the differentiation had transpired, that the nature that we're talking about is the same thing. For the same reason, Adam before Eve differentiated from him is not the same as Adam after Eve differentiated from him.
I think you get intimations of this difference, which is so crucial. I do completely agree, in maybe more mystical writings. So someone like Gregory of Nyssa, the early church father, he would say that creation is actually an aspect of eternity and is already complete in the divine, and that what we're experiencing in our more everyday consciousness is a kind of unfolding of that in time, a facet of that temporarily experienced. And then in that temporality, you get these differentiations and differences that properly understood are to be known as kind of as myriad manifestations of the one to which it's returning. So I think that you can get intimations of this in the more mainstream tradition. And another example perhaps that I was contemplating the other day was there's a book by the Russian philosopher called Vladimir Solovyov, and called The Meaning of Love. And Barfield wrote an introduction to the English translation of this book. And I think he probably liked it so much because he felt that Solovyov, in his reflections on the relationship between sex and love, was trying to get back or recover a future possible sense of these things. And essentially what Solovyov does is pick up quite a mainstream problem in evolution, which is the origins of sex. Because it's not actually at all straightforward to know quite why sex came about. For one thing, most creatures, that's the one. Most creatures on planet Earth still don't reproduce sexually. If you think of bacteria, single-celled animals, and even a lot of plants. And then Solovyov notices that that sexual reproduction becomes more and more sort of focused, if you like. The more and more complex and intimate the social relations of the creatures concerned become. And then, sex even becomes uncoupled from reproduction altogether in, say, human beings. I mean, clearly, sex can lead to reproduction, but ideally, for most of the time, sex doesn't lead to reproduction for human beings. And so what Solovyov does is kind of turn it about face and say, well, look, maybe sex isn't the sort of goal, but it's a sort of byproduct of something that's deeper. And that deeper thing, Solovyov says, is love. And that therefore the whole of creation can be seen as a kind of emanation of divine fecundity, of love, of participation in this wider whole, and that for, as it were, certain strands of this wider whole, the notion of reproduction, not through other manifestations of love, like emanation, which maybe would have a kind of plant-like corollary in the way that plants would divide in order to reproduce, but that we human beings participate in this sexual expression of this divine love that we know in the narrow material sense as reproduction, but that is but one sort of erotic expression of the wider relationship between the creator and the created. The heart of the idea is that it's not that that love is the way that evolution fools us into staying together in order to raise children that have been sexually produced, but rather that sex is kind of riding on the back of this much deeper truth about the nature of our existence, which is that it's an expression of love, and it's in the divine fecundity that one mode of reproduction is sexual. And anyway, I quite like that because it sort of helped me to try and reimagine the narrow evolutionary story, following Darwin, picking up on a real problem that comes up in Darwinian evolution, and setting it in this much wider frame to come up with a different story that may actually be, really quite suggestive in terms of science, let alone in terms of understanding our participation with the wider world. Max?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on what you were laying out in respect to Solovyov's redemption of sex, I guess, the spiritual redemption of sex. And one obvious, so maybe that I can try to illustrate this with an analogy. If we consider Plato composing the allegory of the cave, he's composing the allegory of the cave because he starts with something that he's attempting to depict. Like there's a real process or evolution that you can call it by different names, like philosophical ascent, enlightenment, striving towards wisdom, level of wisdom. But the problem is that's not visible. Like it's invisible. It's something that happened. I mean, what does that look like? It doesn't have a look. It's an interior process. But then through there's one of the certain way this mystical power in the universe is the power of analogy. Like what is it that allows us to analogize things? I don't know. It's like this sinews maybe of the mystical body of Christ or something, this imaginative power of analogy. And so you just consider somehow Plato was able to depict this thing that has no look, doesn't look like anything. He's able to depict it in a visual, iconic series of images. If we think about, and I think also a tradition notion is creation is actually emblematic or iconic in that way. And so you can think of the bodily union between lovers as a symbol for what is happening. So, but you realize this, to unite with somebody in that way, you run into edges or surfaces or boundaries, and you can only get so close to another person, and then you run into your edges and you can't get any closer than that. And that's the sort of law of the physical universe. It's two objects can't occupy the same space at the same time. You see the way though in which if you think of your psychic or emotional life, it's much more permeable. It doesn't have those clear differentiations. So you can what is possible in relation between two bodies, the union that's possible between two bodies, it's transcended in the union between two souls. And then further, it's but nevertheless, you still retain your own unique psychological signature, and that you could think of and that's something you're doing that you're doing in the way that you do any ordinary activity. Perhaps the highest form of love is something that in which you're participating in love as a principle, or the Novalis calls it the Amen of the universe. It's something cosmic that you're actually in sort of what you could think of as, so you have bodily love, psychological love, spiritual love would be something that it's both of you step into something that's much higher than you. And then if you, at least for me, if I conceive of sexual union in those terms, it's not something. I mean, it's perfectly emblematic of the higher worlds. It's just that, like any depiction, it has its limitations, and it's not the same thing as the thing that's being depicted, and it's an expression of it, but it's not an identity with it.
Hey, look, so I don't know whether, Landon, you'd like to add anything, but I'm thinking about segueing a bit more into thinking about the links with Steiner and the links with Lewis. But do you want to just add a bit more to this? I mean, one thing we maybe haven't quite nailed is this notion of Barfield's sense of the evolution of consciousness, and how it's different from Darwinian evolution. But maybe you've got something else to say as well.
Well, maybe I can make the segue, because something that's been said is this idea that this power of analogizing, that there's something of substance in our metaphors if they're to be valuable at all. They can't just be, decorations to speech or flowery expressions that we use to make writing more appealing or speaking more appealing. And I think this gets to the link between Barfield and Lewis. I think the differences between them are actually usually overstated. And part of the reason for that is that Barfield himself overstated them. And that may have been a concern that because of his, bond of friendship with Lewis, he was more troubled than we might be about the differences that were still there. But Lewis has this beautiful passage, and this is actually the passage that took me to Barfield when reading Lewis, researching for my master's thesis on his understanding of the imagination. It comes from an essay called Blue Spells and Violence Fairies, and it speaks to the issue. Lewis defines the imagination as the organ of meaning as opposed to reason, which he said is the natural organ of truth. And then he goes on after defining it to say, it is, I confess, undeniable that such a view indirectly implies a kind of truth or rightness in the imagination itself. So while in one way he's contradicting Barfield, he's also making an enormous concession here by saying, he's not saying outright that Barfield's right, but in the context of the conversations they were having, this is saying, in substance, Barfield's right about this, that there's a kind of truth or rightness in the imagination itself. And thence I confess it does follow that if our thinking is ever true, then the metaphors by which we think must have been good metaphors. And it does follow that if these original equations between good and light, or evil and dark, between breath and soul and all the others, were from the beginning arbitrary or fanciful, if there's not, in fact, a kind of psychophysical parallelism or more in the universe, then all of our thinking is nonsensical. But we cannot, without contradiction, believe it to be nonsensical. So that idea that the imagination is a truth-bearing faculty, as some have characterized Barfield's view. I'm not sure he ever characterizes it that way, but that's the idea. And that when we use our imagination, we're not just exercising some faculty contained in our head. We're participating in a cosmic reality. And the only reason why that bears fruit, if you will, is because there's this sort of psychophysical parallelism in the world, that the images that we use, if they're really good images, are really revealing truth about the things that in our state of consciousness we separate out, like a physical image with a spiritual meaning or something like that. But that can't quite be how it really is. There's something deeper going on. And I think that concession that Lewis makes there is, he's in substance saying, I've got reservations, but Barfield's really right when it comes to the nature of the imagination, which was one of the two major divides between them.
Yeah, so certainly the earlier Lewis was inclined to say that the imagination sort of added color to truth, but wasn't the truth itself. And I think Barfield would even be nervous about the notion of imagination as a truth-bearing faculty, because it still carries this sense that there's a separation between what you're trying to contemplate and the contemplator, that imagination can somehow bridge. Whereas he's saying, no, if this power of analogy, this sense of meaning, to really think through how that works, it must lead you to the conclusion that imagination itself is the nature of reality, and that our imagining is participating in that wider imagining completely. And so, we're being inspired in the older sense, to evoke another word that's changed so much meaning. Something's been breathed into us even as we breathe in, and imagination is very much like this. I think Lewis got quite close to it in a talk or sermon he gave, which is now published as Transposition, where he talks about how art and music work, and how music, which is sort of sound waves, if you like, but communicates so much more, is a kind of transposition from a higher world into the world of music. And so that's why it's so meaningful. And then another figure who I think understood this, that both Lewis and Barfield shared, was the figure of Dante. And certainly in the Paradise, music and smiles are all over the place in Paradise. And I think the reason for that is because music and smiles aren't just signs, and they aren't even symbols, like they communicate something, but they participate in that which they are signs and symbols of. When you see someone who smiles, you don't, as it were, say, oh, they're smiling, therefore they must be happy, therefore I can be happy in response, go through some kind of sort of mechanical processing. You are always already in the smile, sharing the joy with the other person. But the fact also that the smile is a sign still, is a symbol, also reminds you, as it were, that it's participating in the wider smile of the cosmos as a whole. So for Dante, ascending through the Paradise, he's constantly monitoring the nature of Beatrice's smiles, and the smiles become more and more beautiful as they increasingly merge and become impossible to differentiate from the smile of the cosmos as a whole. And at that point, towards the end, he knows that he knows directly, consciously, that he's participating in the divine life. So look, it's really worth teasing these things out. Thanks, because again, we're sort of pointing to the radicality of where Barfield's pushing us. But Max, say some more.
Well, I think the smile is a great example. It's like supremely illustrative. One place in which that unity between like the outer and the inner, or the sign and the meaning, one way in which participation is already present for us is in the human face. And you never just look at a human face as, or like human expression, for instance, as a series of facial contractions of the facial musculature. Sure, you can see, but it's the same way you never look at a page of text that's intelligible to you in a language that you understand. You never look at it as like, the contours of the individual letters, or the composition of the paper and the ink. Rather, it's not that you reject that or deny that it exists. Sure, it's right there, but the point is it's in a certain way transparent. Light from a higher world, a world of meaning, is shining through like a open window. And for us, the human face is that way. We don't see it as just a pattern of facial musculature. We see it as the play of the human soul along the surface of the body. And so it's like the face is it's something that is actually transparent to us in the way that Barfield intimates as the final participation. All of creation can become this open window for us. And I'd like to just add one more comment vis-a-vis the reality of imagination, I guess. And it's the following: it's that it's in a certain way it's strange and kind of, I don't know, abstract to like cast aspersions on the reality of imagination, when it's one thing for certain is that the universe is a place of imagination. And the reason you know that for certain is because we experience imagination, and we're not some other place besides the universe. So one thing you know for sure is the universe is the kind of place that gives birth to these loci of imaginative and analogizing power, basically. And so I find like some of the arguments against imagination, and by an extended, in a larger sense, just all kind of inner states, consciousness, and so on. I find them somewhat almost like a little bit ridiculous, and certainly tiresome. The idea that somehow the universe is one way, and then our own experiential lives are some other way. one thing you know for sure is the universe is the kind of place that gives rise to exactly the experiential lives that we all enjoy. So.
Yeah, no, that's very well put. I mean, I suppose it's part of the alienation that we might even imagine that somehow our imagination is our private creation or private faculty, and that's not shared by the rest of the cosmos. And I really like what you say about faces too. I mean, one of C.S. Lewis's later stories is called Till They Have Faces, of course, and in many certainly in Islamic mystical traditions, it will be said that the mystic knows that everything is the face of God. And so there's a lot of resonance there with what you're saying. Landon.
Yeah, thanks. I also very much appreciate the image of the human face and the smile as something that is still transparent to us, as Max put it. And we used that example here in the book to try to illustrate this idea of what it would be like to see the world in this way or to participate. It's hard not to avoid the sort of dualistic language that is itself a result of our alienation, but to participate in the way that Barfield describes. But my favorite example, and one that Mark, you might appreciate, comes from William Blake. And I'll just read briefly. Another example of participation can be culled from the life of English poet William Blake in an exchange of correspondence with one of his contemporaries. Blake, when asked whether the sun rose, he did not perceive, quote, a round disk of fire, somewhat like a guinea, responded as follows: "Oh, no, no. I see an innumerable company of the heavenly host crying, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty." And so for Blake, I don't think he was saying, no, this is what it represents or symbolizes to me. It was a perception, an immediate reality to him. And Barfield quotes that passage, I think, on more than one occasion. And to me, it just so beautifully illustrates like the way of seeing that it seems so difficult, but at maybe in rare moments in my life, I've got an inkling of what that means, to look out and see not objects that are all behaving in conformity with the fixed laws of nature that can be manipulated for various uses or whatever, but a manifestation of the divine.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for the reference to Blake, and it reminds me of another way that I think that Blake put it. He wrote a sort of rather ecstatic poem once where he looks out and he sees sand, and he sees particles in the air, and he sees flowers, and he sees mountains, and he sees meteors in his mind, he sees clouds, basically names everything, and then says, and they're all men seen afar. In other words, if we saw them aright, didn't see them afar, but saw them close, we would see that we share in the same nature as all these things as well. And that's because they share in the divine nature. Yeah, look, it's very helpful to get these examples in, actually, I think, because sometimes people read Barfield and the abstract case is made, but you're kind of reaching for illustration so you can feel it as well. And maybe that's something that Lewis and Tolkien at their best sort of had on Barfield, that they were able to take what he said and write it into fictions that live. I was hoping just to touch on as well on Steiner. And Max, I mean, I noticed you used the expression higher worlds a few minutes back, and that's quite a Steiner kind of phrase. But I wonder whether one way of doing it is to point out that both Steiner and Barfield are very Christian in a certain kind of way, in that they think the figure of Christ, of Jesus, represents a turning point in this story of unfolding and return, this evolution of consciousness. I don't know whether that's one that particularly resonates with you, but I feel it's very important, again, related to what we were just saying, because this isn't just some sort of abstract or, let alone mechanical process of unfolding, but is one that most fully is known and seen in the life of a person. The word made flesh, the divine principle, fully transparently seen in human form. And so this notion of Christianity, maybe it's also quite interesting because it sort of clearly links to Lewis's notion of Christianity, but rather than seeing the figure of Jesus being the individual that bridges a gulf between humanity and the creation and the creator, which, for example, Lewis would try to articulate in Mere Christianity. No, it sees Christ as the revelation of the true nature of the relationship between creator and creation, which is actually that it's all one. So it's a revelation of the unity rather than a bridging of the gap. Now, look, Lewis and Steiner say lots of things about Christianity. It's hard to summarize them in a sentence or two. It's bound to do them a disservice. But Max, have you any thoughts on that element as well? Maybe bringing a bit of Steiner for us.
Yeah, I mean, I'll do my best. I feel this is a topic that no matter how much you say, you'll only be, scratching the very surface. I think one of the obstacles to Steiner that a lot of people encounter is they don't actually engage first with Steiner's foundational philosophical texts. And I feel what those supply is actually, again, like a basis or a ground. They lay a groundwork for then his later esoteric, anthroposophical, and Christological texts. And Steiner describes in some of his early epistemological writings, both on his own account and also as an interpreter and editor for Goethe's scientific writings, he described this sort of phenomenology of perception for us. And for us, in the current state of human consciousness that Barfield also, of course, is repeatedly indicating. We have, for us, the world divides itself into percepts, which is say perceptions without intelligibility. Percepts on one side, sensations, you could think of them as sensations, but they don't have to limit them actually to the physical senses. So percepts to one side, and ideas, concepts, meanings, whatever it is that basically lends intelligibility to those the blooming, buzzing confusion of the way the world just confronts us without any, before we bring to bear our thinking upon it. And so you see thinking as like the active power that binds or joins together the percept and the concept, following its initial basically discrimination as a just function of the structure and geometry of our contemporary human consciousness. And so if you grasp the differentiation or the gulf that we experience between percept and concept, and we unite them ourselves as in the act of perception, but there's often something quite provisional about them, and we all understand the way in which what we see is just as much a function of what we are able to see as what is before us. I'd like to just kind of place that as a pattern or an image, that the percept concept, that differentiation, and then the way it can be restored. And then I'd like to array one more sort of example like this. And that's what we already touched on in respect to the human face. You can think of the human face as like one point in which the identity between soul and body, for instance, or between meaning and perception, between the inner and the outer, it's been restored to at least to some extent. Imagine whatever that pattern is that I've tried to lay out in those two cases. Imagine it like achieving its full consummation in a single being. What is for us kind of encountered in this dualistic state. In one man, the original perfect unity was restored. And in the same way that we can start for ourselves, we can start with the human face and grasp what that means. And then it can become a task for us actually to restore that unity in the rest of creation. Like Landon was talking about, you can see a tree and actually take inspiration from the tree and think, I could be as upright as that tree. I could be as stoic as that tree. I could be as diligent as that tree. And it's all right there before you, but take some initiative on your part. Well, if you can think of the human face as leavening that's sort of placed in this world for us, but the leavening over time can. So in the same way, Christ can be compared to leavening, and it's like once one, man has done that, then for all of us, it's possible to follow. So I guess that's what I'll say at this point, with the full acknowledgement that that's only just like a grain of sand compared to what could be said.
Yeah, no, I think that's right with Steiner, is that people, it's worth knowing that he was a kind of quite significant post-Kantian philosopher, and so was trying to break these things down in a German idealistic sort of style, I guess. I mean, you made me think as well. You were talking that because in one of his earlier works, he writes about freedom and the nature of freedom, and I think what he says about freedom is quite similar to what we've been saying about imagination as well. That the freedom that we experience in our minds as we move imaginatively sort of around our lives, around the cosmos, even around nature, that's an intimation of the fullest sense of freedom that we're invited to know, and that so I guess a figure like the Christ, fully human, also would know. Something like that anyway, links between freedom and imagination, if that makes sense to you.
I think it's an important connection, and in a certain way, Christ is the only free being, in the following sense. Like, in order for us to act out of freedom, Steiner points this out, like, it makes no sense to talk about freedom in the sort of like existentialist libertarian sense of like being able, like nihilistically, like I can do whatever I want and nobody's going to stop me. The reason that makes no sense is the following analogy or illustration, I think, will make it clear. Like, imagine claiming, like, putting a blindfold on and then driving down the road in a truck, and you think, well, I'm free because nobody's going to stay my hand and I can, it's kind of absurd to think of it that way. You're not free in the slightest, because you have no idea, like you have no vision of the consequences of the actions that you will subsequently take. It would be like saying I'm free to vote for whatever candidate I want, but not having like the names listed next to the bubbles or something. So sure, you can fill in any box that you want, but there's no freedom in that. It's perfectly arbitrary. The only way to be free is to have like perfect wisdom, perfect knowledge. And so in a certain way, only God is perfectly free, and we achieve freedom by sort of participation in that. And what it means to have knowledge is to have, it's like when you're, like, the way we act freely is by it's a sort of creative process almost. We are able through intuition to grasp a concept or something we like to do, whether it's lending a helping hand to somebody else. And if our like instinctive reaction takes precedence over our understanding of that action, it's okay, but it's not an example of an action done out of freedom. It's when the reverse happens that we are able to envision a concept and then incarnate that through our limbs into our bodies. And you can imagine Christ as like the perfect, and so we're all integrating then towards the concept of what is possible for us as human beings and our potential. And then you can imagine Christ as like the limiting case. And it's sort of like it's one of those almost koans, but imagine when we encounter another person, we first encounter the percept of that person and then have to try to supplement it with the concept of that person or the meaning of that person. Imagine a being in which those two things were perfectly identical, like not separate. And it almost transcends what's possible to imagine, but I think it's a useful exercise in any case.
Yeah, it's almost like saying that true freedom is the state in which freedom disappears, because in a funny sort of way, it can be no other.
It's paradoxical. Think like, oh, becoming more free means I have more choices. And you can only say that until you really try to walk the path to freedom. And then you realize it's actually more and more all of your so-called choices converge on the single, best alternative, the one that leads you in the most direct way towards the good. And in a certain way, freedom for man means being a servant to God. And there's no other way around it.
Thank you. Yeah. Look, I wonder if we should try and say something about poetry as well. I don't know whether, Landon, that is on your mind, or whether you'd like to pick up some of the things which have been said already. But certainly we should, because poetry, I guess, is another way in which Barfield maybe initially got onto this sense of participation.
Yeah, he starts Poetic Diction by saying, look, this isn't going to be any attempt at a scientific investigation, if by scientific you mean limited to what can be verified empirically or anything. He said poetry, its substance is consciousness. And that being said, we should look at the phenomenology. What happens to us consciously when we read a great poem? And then he describes it. He says, when I read a great poem, it's this: there's a felt change of consciousness. And so in a way, and in particular, I think he was experiencing the unifications of concepts that had been torn asunder in modern consciousness, that he saw one thing not as a representative of another, but as a part of something else. And some of that ancient unity of consciousness was for him restored, but it's something that he could self-consciously contemplate. So it was even better. And that was the power of poetry for him, that felt change of consciousness. And that turned him on to this idea that the farther you look back, if you understand the languages in which the oldest poems were written, then the more reliable this felt change of consciousness is, the more likely you are to experience it when you really take in the meaning of the poem, not logomorphically by, in your head, translating it into not just our words, but our concepts, but by really taking in the concepts, the meanings of the words as they meant.
Yeah, and I think this is another really important thing, I think, for Barfield, that poetry, although he's often put in and amongst the romantics, poetry for him is not about self-expression primarily, although it does do that. It is about connecting with reality itself, because in the experience of a poetic word bringing about this shift of consciousness, that is actually a re-engagement of your consciousness with the consciousness of all things. It's what he also called romanticism coming of age, I think, that rather than romanticism, as it's often taken, being seen as the sort of expression of kind of a longing for return, a longing for connection, a longing for reanimation, for re-enchantment. And poetry, in articulating that, is actually already the re-enchantment, the return. If you can consciously shift your attention towards what poetry is actually enacting, what poetry is actually manifesting. And this has very tangible impact in his life, because he writes poetic diction when he's in his 20s, and the discovery of poetry lifts him out of quite a severe depression. I think at one point he says that he even became suicidal. He felt so kind of locked in a dead and mechanical world, and that he wondered if it was worth living at all. And when he realized that if he didn't ask of a poem, what do you mean? What are you trying to convey? But instead just stayed with the spirit, with the energy, the smile, you might say, of a poem, then that's when it really opened up and reconnected him with, it became an ontologically significant moment, not just an expressively significant moment.
Yeah, he described that depression as this feeling that everything around him was just sort of dead and inert, but something inside him was so burningly alive. And poetry helped him reconnect what was alive, burningly alive inside of him, with the world beyond him, which he had sort of developed the habit of seeing as inert and lifeless and insignificant.
Look, this has been a very rich conversation, and I'm conscious that we've been going for well over an hour, and we should perhaps begin to draw to a close. But I just wanted to check with you guys whether there's anything else which is burning now inside you that can lift our consciousness once more, even that little bit further.
There is one last comment I would like to make that I think maybe I'm flattering myself, but I think it could actually summarize a lot of what we've been talking about in a single, single point or single, thesis, which is there's no such thing as a literal description. That doesn't exist. That's a chimera. That's something that people imagine. There's no such thing as a literal description. You can point to any individual attempt at a literal description, and just sort of peel back what's really being said and discover the sort of analogical poetic quality. But even you don't have to do that. You don't have to go that far. You can just recognize that every description is conveyed by means of language, and language is inherently imaginative, inherently analogical, inherently metaphorical. And so we should just sort of like put away the childish things and leave behind the superstition that somehow, like the quest for knowledge, the scientific quest is like, approximating some ultimate literal description of things that never existed in the beginning, and it's not going to exist at the end.
Yeah, look, that is really very well put. I was reading some Nicholas of Cusa the other day, who I think must feature in Barfield's work at some point, but he makes a comparable point by saying that actually all language is praise. And his idea there is that because our language is always already participating in, the divine logos, that which is spoken from the mouth of God, that we're in our speaking are not doing anything literal, as you're suggesting there, sort of, marking out, treating as objects and so on, but are actually, if we understood it properly, returning that which we're sharing our life with to the divine life in an act of speech, through metaphor, through the calling to try to as richly and beautifully and fulsomely talk about these things. That's why we get sort of excited about it. We Barfield lovers and others, it can be seen as a kind of act of praise, an act of return. So look, maybe that's a good point to finish on, because whilst Barfield does give us big theories about shifts of consciousness across millennia, he does also help us see how even in the minute particular moments of life, to give a final nod to William Blake there, precisely the same process is going on actually. And so, reading about the big story, reading about the nature of poetry can awaken a sense of participation, even intimations of what he called final participation in the here and now. So it's deeply practical actually, and relevant to life day by day, as well as telling big stories about humanity and whatever else. But look, thanks very much indeed for joining me. Just a reminder, your book is What Barfield Thought. We clearly feel that Barfield is crucial to making sense of modern times, and restoring a vision of what life is about, not just what life can be about. So look, thanks really very much for your book too. And I've really enjoyed the conversation. That's a good sign, I think, because when one dialogues about these things, it should too be this shift of consciousness. As Barfield says, it's a bit like moving the magnet through the electric field. We've been kind of moving the magnet through the electric field, and I'm glad to say I feel some current has flown as a result. So thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.